It's now my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Igor Grant. He is a distinguished professor, chair of psychiatry, and director of the HIV Neurobehavioral Research Program and the Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research at the University of California, San Diego. He's a neuropsychiatrist who graduated from the University of British Columbia School of Medicine, had specialty training in psychiatry at the University of Pennsylvania, and additional training in neurology at the Institute of Neurology in London. His academic interests focus on the effects of various diseases on brain and behavior, with an emphasis on translational studies in HIV and on drugs of abuse. He's contributed to approximately 700 scholarly publications and is principal investigator of several NIH studies and co-director of the HIV Neurobehavioral Research Center. Everybody, please welcome Dr. Igor Grant.
Good morning, and thank you very much for your kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank the organizers of this summit for inviting me and for launching an exciting program. I got here yesterday afternoon and got a chance to sit in on the afternoon presentation and also the great poster session. So that was all really great. It's also a pleasure for me to see a number of friends and colleagues that I do run into from time to time. Some of you will have heard some of what I'm going to say before, so the test will be easier for you at the end of the session. And if you need to cheat, you could go to cmcr.ucsd.edu online. Some of these slides are there as well. So I think no introduction to medicinal cannabis can proceed without paying homage to the man who really started the field, and that's Raphael Majulah, Israeli scientist who really was the first to characterize tetrahydrocannabinol as the active ingredient in marijuana, the active psychoactive ingredient, that is. And we were very fortunate that Dr. Majulah did serve as an external advisor when we set up the Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research at UC San Diego, and he's still an active and lovely man. Now, it will come as no surprise to you that cannabis has been around a long time. I'm not going to go back to 8000 BC, as some speakers have done, because that would take a while. But it is interesting that here is a date-stamped 1913 bottle from Eli Lilly Company that illustrates the properties of cannabis americana. I want to emphasize the Americana part, where that it was native. And but it's interesting that even at that time, the anecdotal evidence suggested some of the properties that we are beginning to confirm really are true: the antispasmodic, antiemetic, some of the other properties. So why has this become popular in the last couple of decades? Clearly, there were a number of convergent trends. Some of these were political, some of these were scientific, and some of these involved anecdotal evidence that was growing apace. So that's provided on this slide here. But I think the interesting thing is that the anecdotal evidence and some of the political shifts really having to do with public's general perception that cannabis was not as bad as it was cracked up to be. Cracked up to be, that's a bad, sorry. Lecturing on cannabis, there are no number of double, triple, and quadruple entendres that one slips into, so just bear with me. But the, I think, really exciting trends had to do with advances in neurobiology, which started really figuring out what are the ways in which THC particularly affects the brain and the body. And so that led to the discovery of the cannabinoid receptors, so-called CB1 and CB2 receptors. There may be others that will be discovered. And then that led further to the discovery of the endogenous molecules, signaling molecules, that worked with these receptors, and the two that are well characterized are anandamide and 2-AG. Now, this map I always hesitate showing because every month I have to change it. But roughly speaking, we now have 27 states of the Union that permit some reasonable access to medicinal cannabis, and then the green ones are the ones that have legalized marijuana entirely. Missing from there, by the way, it looks like is Guam, and I think there's something, Puerto Rico, I guess, as well. I don't know if there's anybody here from Puerto Rico. But the point is that the majority now of the country has at least some access to medicinal cannabis. Now, those of you who are in the field, bear with me if I show you some very primitive cartoons. But basically, this is to remind us that these cannabinoid receptors, be they CB1 or CB2, are widely distributed in the body. CB1 tends to be more concentrated in the nervous system, and I'll show a little bit more of that in a moment. But they are also found in the gut, the liver, ovaries, uterus, all throughout the body, cardiovascular system and so forth. The CB2 receptor tends to be more involved in immune signaling and immune regulation, although it is also found in the brain and central nervous system. Here's my version of the brain. Forgive me for its somewhat primitive nature. But the idea is to really illustrate through the depth of the green coloring where is the concentration, in this case, of CB1 receptors. And I think by looking at that, you can then infer what is going to be the action of agonists such as tetrahydrocannabinol on the brain. So you can see, just to select a few, there's a high concentration in the amygdala. That is an organ, or a nucleus rather, that has a lot to do with fear and anxiety modulation and stress response. You find it in the cerebral cortex, has to do with executive function, higher thinking functions. In the hippocampus, so memory can be affected. And in other areas that control eating and vegetative behaviors. So from this you can see that there are really widespread effects that are possible. Now, we don't need to go through this. I mentioned the two endogenous cannabinoids are anandamide and 2-AG. And they have really kind of an interesting way of acting. For those of you who have studied neuroscience or even lay kind of knowledge of it, know that neurotransmitters act by an electrochemical signal being propagated from one cell to the next cell, right? So it could be dopamine, acetylcholine, whatever. The endocannabinoids act differently. They're really regulator molecules. I call them circuit breakers at times. So in this illustration, let's say we have the propagation of an excitatory signal through glutamate. That goes to the neighboring cell and it will stimulate that cell. But simultaneously, that receiving cell elaborates, in this case, 2-AG, one of the endocannabinoids, which then docks back on the first cell and regulates the further release of that glutamate. So there is this regulatory function that seems important in the endocannabinoid system. And the reason I mention that is that I think in the future there is going to be a whole class of medications, whether they be derived botanically or synthetically, that take advantage of this regulatory function. That's just to brag a little bit that we have a Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research, and I think the serious point here is that that was established over 20 years ago, and I think University of California and the state of California are to be congratulated for kind of being at the forefront of beginning this kind of work. We now have a number of centers and programs throughout California that are doing wonderful work. UCLA has a center, UC Irvine, Davis, San Francisco, probably insult people by naming all of them, but there is a real growth of interest in this area. But we were pleased to be there kind of early on. And the way it happened was interesting. First of all, California passed, as you know, the first in the country medicinal cannabis law, which was the Compassionate Use Act. And something wonderful happened, at least in my experience, now that we look at how politics is going these days. One of the proponents of the medicinal cannabis law, Senator John Vasconcellos, unfortunately the senator has passed away, wonderful man. He was very passionate. He really believed in medical marijuana, but at the same time, he came to the university and said, you know, the way to really advance his agenda was to develop the science basis for it, and how can we do that? And so based on that, he authored legislation that established the CMCR, and we ended up conducting some of the first of kind of the modern era studies on medicinal cannabis. But I do want to always give a shout out to Senator Vasconcellos and his colleagues. And currently we have in the legislature also people who are very interested in this topic, not by way of furthering a specific agenda, but really understanding. I love this chart. Those people who think, okay, marijuana is legal in Washington, California, whatever, now we can do all this research. Not. The only legal source of at least plant-derived cannabis for medical research is the federal government through NIDA's program. And they have a farm, as I'm sure you've heard, at the University of Mississippi, which we visited one time. That's a fun place. If you want to do a study, you have to go through a number of steps. And I only illustrate all this, not to make you dizzy, but to show you that the research can be done. It's not true that the feds or some evil people there are blocking research. That is not true. But what is true is it takes time and patience and resources to organize these studies. So in the case of the CMCR, for example, we received an allocation in the 2000s, and we issued a call for proposals. By the way, we'll be issuing a new call for proposals. I'll come back to that. And based on that, we had a review from an external scientific board of our own. We then had to consult with the Research Advisory Panel of California, which is an entity that has to approve controlled substance research in California. And then there are a number of federal steps. In the early days, there had to be approval by the DHHS, Health and Human Services. This actual little 3-set box is now gone. But then there still had to be approval from the Food and Drug Administration, the DEA. I always like to tell the story. The DEA review is at 2 levels. One is at Washington, and then once they are okay with that, then you have to deal with or work with local DEA agents. And they sometimes have interesting perspectives. So for example, we were doing one study on the UC San Diego campus in sort of trailers. You know, UC system is not always the fastest at moving temporary structures into permanent ones. These temporary structures have been there only 20 years. They were going to eventually get to be buildings. But anyway, it was an outpatient CRC, or clinical research center. So we had set up our testing in that area, installed vacuums to get the smoke out and all that stuff. But when the DEA agent came, he said, well, where are you going to store the marijuana? I said, well, it's going to be in this safe right here. He said, well, but you can't do that. The entire trailer isn't bolted to the, to the pad, the concrete pad. What if somebody moved the entire trailer? And so on and so forth. So there are interesting considerations that you have to go through. And it took at that time, and I think it's probably still true, from the time you actually submit a proposal to actually getting product that you can administer to a participant in a human trial, takes about a year. Maybe it's shortening a little bit. But just so you know. Our original studies were in a number of places. I'm just going to show you one example, which is a UC San Francisco study by Dr. Donald Abrams. And what he was interested in is the question of neuropathic pain. Neuropathic pain is a kind of chronic, disabling, very uncomfortable sensation. It involves sometimes burning, tingling in the feet and hands, hypersensitivity to light touch, and various symptoms of that nature. And these are not the kinds of pain that are actually well treated with opioids, for example. Opioids are terrific if you have a gunshot wound, or if you're recovering from surgery where they've cut you open and sewed you up and everything hurts. But for neuropathic pain, they do work, but they have to be given chronically. The doses tend to have to get escalated and so forth. There are other treatments for neuropathic pain. They include certain kinds of antidepressant drugs, anti-epileptic drugs, and so forth. But there was certainly preliminary evidence, both anecdotally and from animal research, that this kind of pain might respond to cannabis, and particularly THC-containing products. So that was the basis of Donald Abrams' study. So people with HIV/AIDS tend to suffer from this kind of pain. So he identified 50 participants and first of all screened them on an outpatient basis, evaluated them, then they were admitted to an inpatient unit, and then they were randomized to either receiving marijuana, which was smoked with 4% THC, or placebo marijuana, like decaf coffee, I guess. It smelled about the same, but didn't have the punch. So what happened was, as you can see, the red line, which is the active treatment, showed a significant improvement in neuropathic pain over the 1-week trial that the people were in the hospital. And then there was some persistence of that effect even when the trial ended. Important also, by the way, is the yellow line also went down. That's the placebo line. So you have all heard about placebo effects. It's really very important for trials to be cognizant of that. The placebo effect, by the way, is real. These are people who feel better. We don't know the mechanisms, but it's not to be written off as, oh, it's nonsense. So, in the first phase of our being, then, we conducted 7 different small-scale clinical trials. Most of them concentrated on either neuropathic pain or other kinds of chronic pain syndromes, and one involved severe muscle spasticity and multiple sclerosis. And as you can see, I don't know if you can, those of you who are closer to the front maybe can read it. You'll see the concentrations of THC that were involved. In some studies there were several arms, or people sequentially went through different dosage regimens. Some were crossover studies, some were parallel group designs. And you can see that the highest concentration of THC was about 8%, and the lowest was somewhere around 1.3%. I can't see the slide at this angle very well, but I think it's in here. So that's the range of concentrations of THC. We'll come back to that because, as we know, on the street, these would be considered very wimpy concentrations, shall we say, at this point. So one way to look at the possibility of effectiveness is to compute something called a number needed to treat. There are other metrics. But basically, I don't even know if you need to look at the formula, but basically what it is that the lower the number, the more effective the agent is. So in this, whoops, I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself here. In this particular display, what you can see is that the tricyclic antidepressants, which are old line antidepressants like tofranil, Elavil, also known as amitriptyline, imipramine, actually are very good at treating this kind of pain. And interestingly, they do so at a dosage level that is not typically the antidepressant level, so it's at a lower dosage level. We see the same effect for cannabis, by the way. Cannabis then is about the same as gabapentin, which is another commonly used drug in these kinds of conditions, and seems to be outperforming some of the other drugs that are sometimes used. So the main point here is that, at least in the short term, THC-containing cannabis was about as good as many drugs that are used, and so represents another quiver, if you will, in our armamentarium to treat these conditions. So the summary of our studies are there. I've shown you the basic results. In terms of side effects, the commonest were rapid heart rate. Some people felt high, as you would expect. Some felt tired. A lot of them got red eyes. Neurocognitive testing, that is testing of memory, attention, and so forth, revealed, as you would predict, some small decrements while the people were receiving the medications, but those reversed pretty quickly. If you would think of an average drop, it would be about a half a standard deviation reduction in a global measure of cognitive function that then improved. Whether that's any better or worse than other drugs like benzodiazepines, we don't know, because there's actually, if you believe it, a lot of data out there on that. And other side effects were dizziness, and sedation, and so forth, but none of them required treatment discontinuation. So basically, our data showed that yes, there's a signal here, particularly for neuropathic pain, probably for severe muscle spasms in MS, that the treatment was tolerable, didn't have a lot of bad side effects. There were some, so that's was our conclusions. And I think that our conclusions then nested very nicely into this massive report that was produced by the National Academies in 2017. I don't know, is there anybody here? I know Donald Abrams was on that report, Piamelli, I don't know if any of these folks are here. But, anyway, it was a massive review of the literature. By the way, the report is available not only on the National Academy site, but if you go to cmcr.ucsd.edu, we have it posted there if you want to study it. But in summary, oh, stop it. In summary, what they found was very good evidence, basically, for the efficacy of cannabinoids in the treatment of chronic pain, spasticity in MS, which I've talked about based on our studies as well, control of nausea, which we've known all along because Marinol, dronabinol, is an approved drug for the management of nausea. Interestingly, they found moderate evidence for cannabinoid efficacy in improving sleep, particularly in those who may have pain. Now, we haven't personally researched that, but I know in talking with a lot of people my age, one of the things that attracts them to the whole cannabis story is the possibility that cannabidiol may be helpful in helping them sleep, because a lot of old people have trouble sleeping, and some of that trouble sleeping is related to various aches and pains. So I think this is a very promising area of research. They found limited evidence for cannabinoid efficacy in the treatment of anxiety disorders, though I think that is going to change in the future. I think there'll be more promising results there. and in promoting appetite and weight gain. I'm not sure why they put that as limited evidence, because any of you who has had the munchies will know that you eat more, and you eat more of the wrong stuff typically. So, and there is some evidence seriously that in patients with cachexia, AIDS-related weight loss, which fortunately we don't see so much anymore with good HIV treatments, that marijuana was helpful. And then they said insufficient evidence for some other things. Now the one thing that does need to be updated is this thing about epilepsy, because as you know, and I'll come to in a moment, there is a lot of interest in cannabidiol, particularly as an anti-epileptic. So I think there's no question now that cannabis is safe and effective for, at least in the short term, because we haven't done the long-term studies, with certain conditions. However, there are problems. For example, if your delivery system is a joint, there are issues with safety of a combustible substance in a hospital, for example, secondhand smoke, all of these other kinds of things. So it's clear that although that may be a method that people could use in their home safely, that it's not going to be a typical method of administering these medications, and so we have to look at other possibilities. The other thing that this then brings us to is that there are real differences in the pharmacokinetics of THC, CBD, and these other cannabinoids depending on mode of administration. From the standpoint of efficiency, inhaling the stuff is the best because the blood levels rise quickly, and then THC in this case is cleared. This is the left-hand panel here. THC is cleared from plasma fairly quickly. Now it does get redistributed to all the tissues, including the brain. So the effects may continue way beyond when you can see measurable blood levels, because the THC is exerting its effects, particularly in tissues that have a lot of fat. Unfortunately, our brains have a lot of fat. Maybe that's good, maybe that's bad, I don't know. That joke didn't go very well. All right. So, in contrast, when cannabis is consumed by mouth, there are a number of steps that have to occur. It has to go through your stomach, to your small intestine. Part of it gets degraded and is no longer active. Your internal bacteria, they like marijuana, they use it up too. I don't know what the effect on them is, but they take their share. Then has to be absorbed, and next the liver takes a chunk of it, because everything that you take into your gut tends to first pass through the liver, which is kind of like a sanitation plant, tries to get rid of stuff it doesn't think you should have or change things around. So by the time it gets to your bloodstream, the concentration of THC may be fairly low. That's called first pass metabolism. And so the time course is also much extended, as those, if you've talked to people who've either smoked versus eaten, you know that sometimes people don't feel an effect for a couple of hours. And then the effect goes on, and they may or may not like that. The other thing that happens is that the liver can also convert THC into another active ingredient, this hydroxy or carboxy THC, the hydroxy THC. And that is actually quite a potent psychoactive drug in its own right. That particular metabolism doesn't occur when you inhale. So one has to look in terms of those kinds of side effects at the combined actions of both THC and the hydroxy THC. I am embarrassed by this slide because I am sure many of you could send me slides of all sorts of devices and gizmos that are much more modern than this. And if you do, please send me some. I'd love to update this slide. But the main point I want to make is there are increasing numbers of ways of delivering cannabinoids into your system. And some of them do involve other kinds of inhalational techniques that are short of smoking, and others have to do with taking by mouth, dabbing, oral mucosal sprays, rectal, you name it. Almost any orifice will do, it seems. But whether these things are actually absorbed from these different portals also needs to be studied. We know something about the oral route. We really know very little about some of the other things like transdermal. Now, here's our, I feel like somebody from the Dark Ages showing a vaporization system that we kind of affectionately call the Volcano. And basically what this system does is it heats the plant product to a level that is not, doesn't burn it, sub-combustion, and then the volatilized substances like THC can be inhaled. And it turns out that this is a very acceptable way of delivering cannabis through the lungs. Here's a study by Barth Wilsey where he looked at, again, using this Volcano in certain kinds of chronic pain syndromes, and showing that even the very lowest doses here of THC-containing product produced an effect. And that's a point that I think we need to continue to look at. There's obviously concern that if you use a THC-based product, that there could be the cognitive, attentional, and other, and mood and psychological effects. But I think it's very possible that these are dissociable in the sense that to produce the more high type of effects, you need more of the substance than you need to potentially affect a neuropathic pain. So when Wilsey showed that something like 2% containing THC, I mean, who, you know, what high school student would even consider 2% preparation, right? But yet this was helpful in people with pain. So I think this is an important takeaway on that. Another way of non-oral administration is this oral mucosal spray that was developed by GW Pharmaceuticals. And they're the folks that also developed Epidiolex, which we'll come to. And basically, in this particular preparation, they have equal amounts of THC and CBD in a spray that's administered kind of like this. And the idea is that the absorptions from the oral mucosa could bypass a lot of the other problems that I mentioned to you in terms of oral administration. I think it's still, though, not completely clear to me, at least, how much of this oral mucosal absorption is actually from the oral mucosa and how much is swallowed and then comes in through the normal route. And that's something to be explored. And then the Sativex, again, it was effective in the treatment of neuropathic pain, just as with inhaled cannabis. There's a whole industry developing in terms of creating new, novel cannabinoids in the laboratory. And of course, a lot of interest also in so-called trace cannabinoids and terpenes to see whether they work either themselves or through the so-called entourage effect, that the presence of several of these things is better than the presence of any one. Interestingly, we also have seen the development of antagonists to the cannabinoid receptors. So if stimulation of the CB receptors, say, causes you to eat, then it goes to reason that if you actually want to lose weight, because you're eating too many of those nachos or whatever, that you might want to give an antagonist. And there are antagonists that work. Rimonabant was one of them. And they actually worked to help reduce weight, but they did have some bad side effects, such as making people really depressed. Have to balance it. Thin, depressed, fat, happy. So, I've probably insulted a bunch of people. I apologize. That's be a joke. Then we have possibilities of modifying how the body degrades anandamide and 2-AG, these endogenous transmitters. So fatty acid amide hydrolase or FLI inhibitors, monoglyceride lipase inhibitors are also an active area of study. Now I do want to spend some time on the drug that's become very popular, cannabidiol. And it's very interesting that cannabidiol really differs only very slightly chemically from THC, but those little differences mean a lot. CBD doesn't appear to have major psychoactive properties, and it also seems to exert its effects through some mechanisms that actually are outside the endocannabinoid system. This is something sometimes people don't realize. We talk about CB receptors and so forth, and then we lump cannabidiol in the same place as THC. Don't do that. They act very differently. As I'll show you in a moment here. So the kind of reported possible uses of CBD are listed there. I'm sure they're familiar to you. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time on a couple of these. Bless you. I mentioned that CBD does not act significantly through the CB1 or CB2 receptor mechanisms, although it may have indirect effects that are still being looked at. But it does do other things. For example, it seems to affect these transient receptor potential channels, so-called TRVP or vanilloid receptors. And these receptors do have a lot to do with inflammatory pain. And so to the extent that CBD may somehow switch those or tone those down, that may be one of its mechanisms of action potentially in managing pain. And there's another orphan kind of receptor, GPR55, where CBD may have an action. Probably enhances glycine receptor activity, and that may account for some of its anticonvulsant effects. I mentioned FA, this enzyme that degrades anandamide in our bodies so as to limit its availability. Obviously, if you could block that degradation, you could increase the reach of these endocannabinoids. It's possible that CBD also enhances a serotonin receptor that is important in anxiety and mood control. And it may be that it modifies some liver enzymes that have to do with THC degradation. People talk about how CBD may cut or blunt the psychoactive effects of THC when those are taken together. I am not convinced that that's true, but there's certainly a lot of thought about that. But it could be that this is the mechanism if it does work that way. Slide illegible, but it mostly reminds me that studies on CBD and epilepsy actually have a long history. And it turns out that Dr. Majulah, the grandfather of this whole field, did one of the early studies in people and showed that with certain kinds of temporal lobe epilepsies, there was reduction in seizure activity with CBD. And then there's a slew of early animal studies that have suggested that. However, the human studies of the past some of them were not designed to our current standards, had mixed results, so it still remains an open question. The exciting news that I'm sure everybody has read about is Dr. Davinsky et al.'s study with these rare intractable epilepsies of kids, Lennox-Gastaut and Dravet. And they did find that high doses of CBD did reduce drop seizures in these kids. And that led to the FDA then scheduling Epidiolex, which is basically an extract of marijuana that is almost all CBD, but not completely, as a Schedule 5 drug to treat these epilepsies. And that opens the possibility that subject to the companies wanting to do this, that Epidiolex could be available for researchers who want to study other conditions where they think CBD may be an important agent. I do also want to comment on two other areas. One is anxiety. This was an interesting study actually done in Brazil. And let me just walk you through it for a minute. What they did was, they took some people who have public speaking anxiety, and they took other people who didn't. And then they made all these people do a speech on television. And you know that if you have public speaking anxiety, this is not an easy thing to do. And so then they randomized the controls and the public speaking anxiety people into those that did and did not receive CBD. They got either placebo or CBD. So what happened was that here are the people who don't have anxiety. They just kind of float along. This is an anxiety scale, by the way. High means you're more anxious. You can see that people who do have public speaking anxiety and who receive placebo had very high levels of anxiety when they were forced to give this public speech. And that was cut quite a bit by people who were receiving CBD. So it didn't cure them, but it made them feel a lot better. And importantly, in terms of self-assessment, oh, I'm just terrible, I'm a wimp, I just can't do this. Those kinds of symptoms decline significantly in the people with public speaking anxiety who receive CBD. So I think these are interesting clues. Of course, there are going to be studies with more major anxiety disorders, including PTSD, that are starting. The other one I wanted to comment on briefly is an older study reported from Germany on schizophrenia. And basically what they did was randomized people with schizophrenia to two arms. One received amisulpride, which is a standard antipsychotic in Europe, and the others received CBD. And I just want to focus on these two panels here. Okay. What they show is an inventory of so-called positive and negative symptoms of schizophrenia. These are the positive symptoms. Going down means good. You have fewer of them. Positive symptoms are things like hallucinations, frank paranoid thoughts, agitation, those kinds of things. And then this is negative symptoms. Again, going down is good. Negative symptoms are asociality, withdrawal, tending not to interact with people, those kinds of things. And what was interesting in that study is that the positive symptoms were benefited by both treatments, both the antipsychotic and the CBD. But there would seem like to be a differential benefit in the CBD arm for the negative symptoms, which are very hard symptoms to treat and to mobilize people and can be quite disabling. So that's a clue. If it's true, it would be really wonderful. We're going to start actually a study exactly on that. And then the other thing that these investigators found is that, as you may know, many of these antipsychotic drugs have a number of neurological side effects. For example, tremors and other kinds of smacking lip movements and so forth. It turned out that amisulpride, of course, had these, as you would expect, but CBD did not. Also, a lot of these antipsychotics cause weight gain, probably through a dopamine mechanism, actually, in the beta cells of the pancreas. But and CBD didn't have that. So it's possible, I think possible, a glimmer of hope, that CBD might be an alternative that might actually be safer than some of our current neuroleptic drugs. To be seen. Okay, so summarizing. It's clear that, at least in the short term, cannabis, inhaled or taken in some other form, can be helpful in the management of certain conditions, particularly pain, spasticity, and some of the things we've mentioned. Now, the efficacy in sleep problems is worth exploring because these are big problems, particularly in older people. There's a lot of research going on in developing synthetic THC-like molecules, but their utility hasn't been established. I mentioned the CB1 antagonists as possible control of weight gain, showing promise, as I said, in the treatment of anxiety, psychosis, epilepsy, and so forth. Phi inhibitors are being studied, and the anti-inflammatory actions of CBD particularly are of great interest. Now, what are all the health effects of these medical marijuana laws? How much time do we have?
Well, we have a question to that.
Okay, I'm going to wrap it up. Okay. So this whole session, I'm sure, has many, many discussions on public health and policy implications, and so I apologize for presenting a very abbreviated view. But there are some interesting data that have come out, as you know. One has to do with the possible opioid-sparing effects of the cannabinoids. Apparently less prescriptions in certain areas for painkillers where medical marijuana laws have come in. Fewer admissions, fewer deaths. This needs to continue to be monitored because there is a contrary argument that could it be that medical marijuana laws, or legalization for that matter, actually leads to more opioid use, at least recreationally in the long run? I don't think we have an answer to that. One thing I thought was interesting is decreased obesity. I looked up this paper and thought, well, how can obesity decrease if marijuana makes you eat more? But in fact, what may have been the mechanism here is it was older people who had less aches and pains, and so they were walking more and just more physically active, and so they lost a little weight, just like that. And decreased alcohol use has been reported in some studies as well. And then the negative effects, of course, the possibility there will be increased cannabis use, although as you probably know, what's the group that's using cannabis the most more? That's a bad question. Where's been the greatest increase in cannabis use? What age group? People like me, right? Old people. There's actually been very little change in some of the younger age groups. And so we can expect that. And of course, studies on driving are going on, and California has been, I think, at the forefront, actually, of supporting really detailed studies on administration of cannabis and safety on the road. How do we move forward? Well, I always say we need to separate out the discourse on medicinal cannabis. I'm very interested in medicinal from recreational. I think the two have been joined at the hip too long, and that has impeded progress in medical research. We do need to move from proof of principle to larger scale studies to see if these things work in the long term. A helpful step would be to reschedule cannabinoids that contain THC to an appropriate schedule, which is not Schedule 1 with heroin or LSD. It's probably Schedule 3 with codeine, someplace like that. And completely unscheduled CBD, which has no known addictive properties that I know about. And then it's important that there be a regulatory change that empowers states to actually enable investigators to do research on what is actually being dispensed. Because NIDA marijuana, there's nothing wrong with it, but it's one thing, and limited kinds of concentrations of drugs and also modes of administration. But if you came to me now and said, hey, I bought this on La Brea Boulevard or whatever, wherever your dispensaries are, can you tell me what's in it? I cannot. The University of California will tell me, no, we could lose all our federal grants, we could be accused of narco trafficking or God knows what. So there needs to be some accommodation that's sensible that allows, I think, academic institutions to actually help the people. Okay. And some directions in medicinal cannabis research is there. I do want to say something not on the slide. If you go to clinicaltrials.gov, you will see over 50 studies on cannabidiol alone. It's quite interesting, and with all sorts of applications. So it is a burgeoning field for sure. Okay, okay, that's what we're doing. Thank you. And let me say one more thing before you clap and do all that stuff. The CMCR will be issuing, this is for California investigators particularly, a call for proposals, probably in April sometime. We've been allocated some funding through Prop 64. It'll be two kinds of studies, all of them, more modest size. One type of study will be $250,000 a year for 3 years, and another would be pilot studies of $125,000 to $150,000 a year for 2 years. So be on the watch for that announcement. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Graham. We really appreciate it.
We do have a couple minutes for questions. If folks want to come to the mic, we'll just get through a few before we run out of time. I'd like to meet that DEA agent who thought that even the most militant pothead would steal an entire trailer to get his hands on some 4% government weed.
We built a beautiful wall around it.
I'm not touching that. I'm not touching that.
Just a reminder, as folks ask some questions, if you could let us know your name and what institution you're from. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Al Gilbert, CEO of Felton Institute in San Francisco. Thank you for your presentation. Who's interested enough to fund studies about schizophrenia and bipolar and the impact of cannabis?
Yeah, well, there are a few pharmaceuticals that have expressed some interest. For example, companies like Insys, which makes CBD, might possibly have an interest. By the way, when I say interest, there can be two types of interest. One is provide the product, but you get the money to do the study. That kind of interest is easier to get. And then the other kind of interest is where the company actually sponsors a clinical trial. But we believe that there will be some interest by several companies in the schizophrenia story.
Government, regarding the negative impact, because companies are looking for a positive impact so that they can market products, but what about government for the negative impact on schizophrenia or bipolar?
Oh, you mean creating psychosis? Okay, yes, that's an important question. So it is absolutely clear that some people who take marijuana, particularly marijuana with higher concentrations of THC, can develop psychotic symptoms. I mean, that's clear. The real question is it the case that if you use marijuana heavily for a long time, that this causes you to become schizophrenic? That is not an answered question. My own hunch is that what's happening is that the use of psychedelics, including marijuana, can bring forward in time, if you will, the time that you may develop a psychotic break. And the bring forward in time may mean that, you may be one of these people that you have a psychotic propensity, but kind of if you're lucky and live your life right, you will never get it. And if you take, some kind of agent that prods your brain, you might tip over. I think that's more likely. And the reason I say that is if you look at epidemiologic studies from the 50s on, and if you consider that in 1970 we injected this thing into society, marijuana, right? It became available. If it is a psychotogenic thing, we should see a steady rise in rate of schizophrenia and other psychoses from the 70s on, and you don't see that. So to me, that's a note of caution. So I think there are people who are vulnerable, who clearly can suffer from this. Whether, quote, ordinary people using marijuana kind of sometimes would develop chronic psychosis, I don't think that's true. But that's my personal opinion. Yeah. Does that answer your question? I don't know where you went. Yeah, okay, thanks.
Good morning.
William Perno. I'm an alcohol and other drug prevention specialist for, say, San Diego.
Yes.
Just a question on the NIDA marijuana capped at 11, 12, 13% versus kind of what you alluded to, what's being sold in the retail market here in California with THC levels above 90%. So I'm curious if you have any information on actual studies that have been done in the real world, THC of those upwards of 90% levels, and if there are any barriers to doing that type of studies because of risk of harm to the test subjects because of the high potency THC.
Okay, so the first general point, if I can rephrase, is that is NIDA able to provide higher concentration THC products? And the answer is yes. We're doing a study now that has, I think, between 12 and 15% THC. So that's much closer to what's on the street on average. Of course, you can find things that are higher concentration somewhere, but I think on average. So that's true. And what's your second point on risk to the participant giving very high doses?
Yes, so I'm thinking of the THC concentrates, not the plant.
Yeah. And so I think that is a very important question, and we'll just have to see as the studies develop. It is not our intention to give 25 or 30% THC because it's very unlikely those kinds of doses are going to be used therapeutically. I mean, those kinds of doses can drive you nuts temporarily, but that's not what we're looking for in medicine. We want to control your pain and so forth. And as I say, the good news is we think that rather low doses actually may be efficacious, and so we may be able to split out these undesirable effects from the desirable. Also, desirable, undesirable depends on you. If you're a person with terminal severe cancer pain in hospice, it may be that being high is not a bad thing if you want it, if it gives you calm and, a sense of peace. So this is not a black and white question that every psychoactive effect is of necessity a bad thing. It may be a useful thing in some cases. So, yeah.
Good morning. Thank you for your talk and the work that you're doing. My name is Marisha Elkins.
I'm sorry, I'm having a little trouble hearing because of the echo. I'm going to come out. Can I come out closer to you so I can actually hear you?
Sure.
And then kick me off when you're ready to go, okay? But yeah, I'm sorry. It's just there's kind of an echo there. Yeah,
no worries.
Go ahead.
My name is Marisha Elkins. I'm the state's DUI Services Coordinator for the Oregon Health Authority Behavioral Health Division. And one of the struggles that our substance use disorder providers have right now is identifying whether or not someone is using medical marijuana at a therapeutic level. And so we see providers doing things like, say, taking the average of 3-year analysis test results and saying, well, as long as you don't ever have a UA above this level, then you're using it therapeutically, which I haven't been able to find any evidence to support that. But I was curious if you knew of any either past or potential research on identifying therapeutic levels through urine testing.
The answer is no. And urine testing in the area of marijuana, as probably people in the audience know, is very tricky because various cannabinoids, and particularly the non-active ingredients like the carboxy ingredient, can hang around for a very long time. And even THC in chronic users can be detected for many days, weeks sometimes. So there is no, to my knowledge, kind of standard of what's the therapeutic level in plasma, never mind urine. Urine, by the way, is, it's sort of like, it's the swamp that the rivers go into, so it tells you what's happened before. It doesn't actually tell you what's going on in real time either, so it's not very sure what urine is.
Denise Valenti, I own a company that's receiving NIDA funding to research retina, impaired driving, and technology. Although my background, though, is in neurodegenerative disease and vision. I'm curious if you are aware of any colleagues that have plans to further investigate the CBD findings. A number of years ago, one of the papers that used THC findings as a justification because it lowers pressure to argue for glaucoma treatment. That same paper had human studies demonstrating that CBD spikes the pressure, causes a type of glaucoma, which was recently confirmed in an animal model. So the concern is, are we trading off reduced seizures for a slow but impending blindness? Do you have colleagues, because this type of research is so difficult to do legally, that are going to follow up that question in humans?
Well, it's very interesting you asked that, because just very recently the chair of ophthalmology at UC San Diego has been in touch with us to actually look at, they were looking more at the THC angle in lowering pressure. But now that you have reminded me, I think what we need to do is look at CBD as well. So that's a very good point. And the more general message is, nothing is just good or bad, right? Even if CBD is relatively safe, invariably we're going to find problems that we need to know, and particularly in older people who just have more problems and are more vulnerable. So I think I'm glad you raised that point. Thank you.
Hi, I'm the director of the European Drugs Agency. I would like to thank you for your presentation. I have a fresh news for you. The Director General of the WHO has sent on the 25th of January, I have a copy of the letter, a proposal with the conclusion of the expert committee on drug dependence, the 41st and the 40th meeting, and they are proposing to reschedule THC, cannabis, dronabinol, and cannabidiol. And this has to be now discussed at the Commission on Narcotic Drugs in Vienna in March. So if you have any way to support the American position at the CND, this may lead to the reschedule of the substances that would allow better and more research.
Thank you, because I have been reading about the European work moving in the direction of re- and deschedule. Now, will CBD be unscheduled entirely? Is that the proposal? And where would THC end up in this scheme? Somewhere in between, or? Oh, you'll give me the copy. Yeah, one of our UC San Diego colleagues actually worked at WHO for a while, Igor. Is that name? Yeah. So I'm going to ask him about how we provide input to this process. Yeah, but thank you very much, and I'd appreciate your sending me that.
Great. All right, let's give it up again for Dr. Grant. So that concludes our morning keynote, and we will move to our breakout sessions that begin at 10:30. Thanks, everybody.